Hey, Donovan Keith here, and in this video I want to talk through how I might go about building an axis primitive. This is a video in a series for technical directors, and I'm recording this in Cinema 4D 2024.3, so if things are a little bit different in your UI, that might be why. I'd recommend upgrading if you haven't already, and if you really want to follow along exactly, having the exact same version will make your life probably a little bit easier. So here I've got and simple axis primitive. I can sort of adjust the radius or the length of each of the axes, and then I can adjust the thickness or the radius of each of the bands here. And this might not be exactly what we build in the end, but this just sort of gives you a sense of the sort of thing that we might create. And I can show you what this group looks like. And I've already got thoughts for how I might approach this differently now that I've built it once. But I've sort of broken it down into a few different parts. There's the base, which is this thing in the center. I've got an x-axis, right, which is this line right here, which I'm aligning to a side. And then I've also got a cylindrical sort of band for that, and I'm storing that under a named color, which I'm using selection tags and material restrictions to sort of display these. And I'm doing the same thing for each of my other axes, y and z. And I'm connecting all of this into a single object, all of which is powered by these sort of these inputs over here on the side. So I'm going to go ahead and build this from scratch. And let me take a look at my axis group right here, which is just a nodes mesh. So I'm just going to search for nodes mesh, and I get something like this. And the first step that I usually take is, if I'm being good at least, is that I'll actually create sort of like a little Kanban board for myself, or maybe it's Kanban, where I hit command / which opens up the text editor or the note editor, and I can just write in to do. And I just use this, and then I command drag out a note of what my actions are. I'm just sort of creating a rough plan for what I want to do. And so I might, for example, create a single axis, right? That's a good thing to start with. And that axis might be a line, sort of like line / position axis, right? Like we see here. I might want to add a tip of some sort, like maybe a box or a cone. And then I might also want to add a rotation band. And then I might want to create a 3 axes, and I'll probably want to add some colors for each of these. So I'm just going to save incremental here now that I've got my rough plan. I sort of drew this out over here as well, and you'll see I'll also have a doing and done notes just to help structure this. And one thing that I forgot to add that I also want to add is a sphere option, which is sometimes helpful if you're trying to lay out things sort of packed on a surface. That can be helpful. So I'm just going to move doing over here, and let's start on a single axis. Let's just get that going. So first things first, and here I'll select these, and I can hit Command G to group them, and I'm going to call this Kanban. And now for that first axis, I'm going to add a cube. And I'm going to connect this to my output by right-click, output geometry. You may or may not have this keyboard shortcut mapped. If you don't, you can map it yourself, but I'm just using Q to output this. And here you can see that I can adjust the size of my cube to something like this. And maybe for the x-axis, I would do something like, 100, and then it's 5, 5 for each, something like this. Or, looks like maybe 2 by 2, feels about right. And the overall length of this, or the positioning of it, I want it to align with this x-axis. So I'm going to add what's called a geo axis modifier, so the geometry axis. I'm going to drag that on here. And this allows me to sort of adjust the alignment of this thing relative to its bounding box. So I'm just going to slide it over on X. And I'm going to say, I might align X plus. And the cube right here, I'm probably going to want to control the overall length and the thickness using you know, a UI element. So to do that, I'm going to double click in here. And I can go to my user interface at the top, and I've got a bunch of different options. And the one that I want is the IO float size slider. So I'm just going to drag that in, drag in another, and I'm going to say length, or maybe radius, right? Because this is going to be the radius of the overall axis system. And then I'll add maybe a thickness parameter. And I'm going to just adjust the defaults for these. So radius, I'm going to choose to edit port. And radius, let's say the default thickness of 100 is probably fine. 0 to 1,000 seems good. For thickness, I'm going to edit this port as well. And I want the default value probably to be, I think we found what was 2 or 4 felt good. And then the maximum here, I don't think I want this to go all the way up to 1,000, maybe only as high as 100, which already feels pretty excessive. But now I've got a couple of values that I can use to drive this cube. And now I want to expose the parameters I want to connect. So I'm going to command click on this dot, which will expose this on the node, and then I can unfold this and get access to these subports. So because this is the x-axis, and actually, let me think about this. Let's actually do the z-axis, just because some things tend to work a little bit better, like aiming and targeting if you are pointing z forward. So let's just start with that, and I'm going to change my alignment to z+. So adjusting this, and now we slide this C+. So let's go ahead and adjust the radius. That's going to be this Z value here. And the thickness is going to be X and Y. And something I might do is, because I'm going to be connecting up different versions of this, I suspect, I'm going to hit Command Shift on this right here, which will allow me to add in a little connector dot, and I'm going to hit Command / to name this thickness. And now I can directly connect thickness right here to both of these. And I can do that same trick here, Command / or Command Shift click to add that dot, and Command / to name this radius. So now I just have a local copy of those two variables, so it's going to be a little bit easier to manipulate this. And this is feeling pretty good. And the last thing I might want to do is add in an option to store the name of this axis, right? So I'm going to Shift C, and I'm going to search for store, which allows me to store a selection. I'm going to select all, ALL, of the polygons here, and I'm just going to name this as x-axis. And I suspect this name is something I'm going to want to change, so I just expose that by command clicking. So I now have a single axis, and you may or may not want to put this into a group, or you might just like copy and paste this a few times. It really depends on how modular you want things to be and how many times you want to edit things. So I think I plan on making a few of these, so I think it'll be easier for me if I group this. But for now, let's just put it in a scaffold as sort of like an intermediate step just in case. I'm going to call this X or Z axis. And I've got my, oops, I named this incorrectly, Z axis. And I might rename this to store Z axis. And now I've got this. Now, there's a few different ways I could approach my other axes, right? Like my my X and my Y. I could just duplicate this whole thing. And if by holding down Command Shift, I can do that. Or I could maybe get a little bit clever and rotate this. So just take this one system, rotate it, and go from there. And I think that's what I'm going to do long term. For now, let's just build our next axis style, and that is sort of whether or not there's going to be a tip on this thing. So let us add a tip shape So I'm going to say I've got my single axis done for line and position. Great. Now I'm moving on to making that tip. So for the tip, I might choose to, let's see, sort of bring this out here. I'm going to add just a, the simplest version of this would probably be a pyramid. And you can see what the pyramid looks like by tapping Q. It'll output it. I'm going to align this plus Z, right? So it's facing this direction. And I'm going to want to expose the size of it. And I think I also want to, again, use this geometry axis to align it Z+. I'm just going to duplicate this, move it over, tapping Q to align like so. And the size, I'm just going to use this thickness value here to control the size. It's a lot smaller now. And then now that I have this aligned, I want to move it so that it's sort of sitting at the end over here. So I'm going to choose a transform node, transform geometry. Just going to change that to all points, just so it always does this no matter what's selected. And then the transformation, I can choose how I want to do this, but I'm going to transform it radius out on Z here. And this I'm going to group, and let's call it handle, or what am I calling this? I'm calling this my tip. So now I'm going to maybe expand the scaffold to include this as well. Whoops. Let me expand the scaffold, drag it in. There you go. Now it's a member of that. I'm going to call this tip. And maybe what I'll do is move this over. And I'm going to call this section right here line. And the next thing that I might want to include is a band, but I'm just going to save incremental here just in case. So now I've got my rotation band is the next thing that I want to include. So for my rotation band, I'm thinking I can just use a cylinder without caps. That could be a good version of this. Although I think I found that, let me just see what a sphere looks like here. Because I think a sphere, I'm not sure if I want to have that little bit of rounding that I could get from the middle section of a sphere, or if that is just going a bit too far. So you know what, let's just use a cylinder. So I'm going to use a cylinder here. And I'm going to align the cylinder Z+. The radius of my cylinder, I'm going to grab from my radius value. My height, I'm going to grab from this thickness. And let me just output this so we can see what it looks like. And we are getting these caps. So I'm going to turn off caps. And I think that this will be okay. So now I've got my my band, my tip, and my line. And the last thing that I want to do here is to add toggles for whether or not to include each of these elements, because I may or may not want to output a band or a line or something like that. So I'm going to add an if for each of these, and I'm just going to add a geometry object type. So if it's true that I want a line, I can do this right here. So let me add this. I'm going to add this condition over here. I'm going to say line, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with these by adding this sort of control dot. Let's name it line. And if line. And now I can toggle at the root level here whether or not I want to output a line. So if I select this right here, I've got this kind of the group. I can choose whether or not to output a line. I want to do the same thing for these others, right? So I want to choose whether or not to output a tip. And so I'm going to drag this over and choose to add another input. I'm going to call this tip. Command Shift to add this control dot tip. I believe they're called connectors. If tip. And now I can also output this here. So now we can take a look at our tip. If that's on, we've got a tip. Great. And then let's do the last thing down here. I'm just going to duplicate this, call this if band. And I'm going to drag out another line here, band. And now I've got these three different shapes, and I can choose how I want to handle this. But what I'm going to do is connect these three different geometries so that I can output all of them simultaneously. So I'm going to double click to add a connect node, and I can just drag that up here, and then I'm going to drag them in the order of how I want them to sort of go in the object. So band next, followed by tip. I'm going to output this, and now I've got my store z-axis here. And now if I go to my band, I'm just going to adjust my tip, band, and all this to see how this looks. And I would say that I think I want to double the thickness of the tip, or the size of the tip. So if I get here to where the tip is, I've got thickness. I'm just going to come in here and add a multiply, and let me just name this band. When we get to tip, I'm going to add in a multiply, arithmetic multiply node here. And with this, I can take the thickness, and I'm going to multiply it by 2, and I'm going to use this to feed the size. So now I've got that slightly thicker tip, and I've got my entire band right here. I'm just generally, anytime I get to a point where I like what I've done, I'm going to save it just in case I do something that I don't like later. And so now I'm going to create different versions of this, one for each of my other axes. And I could, take this, Command Shift, and drag out another copy. I think that's a very valid way of working, but I'm going to choose not to do that because I want to make it so that if I want to make changes in the future, I only have to really make changes in one location, or that it's easier for me to reconnect and edit these things. So I'm going to, I just rename this more generically axis. And then let's go ahead and take this axis group, and I'm going to choose to group it. So Option G to group, and I'm going to call this, actually that's just a regular group. I want to group this as a nodes mesh because that's kind of what it is. It's a single axis primitive. It's a single sort of vector primitive. Let's call it a vector primitive. And now I've got all of these here. I'm just going to name them tip. This is my line. Band. And then this is my radius. This is my thickness. And then I just want to make sure that I'm using the correct output for my primitive here, because there's some nice properties for sort of automatic linking. I'm going to delete the extra port. And now I'm going to output this, and let's call it vector primitive. And one other thing that I want to do here is, right now the name is z-axis. I want to expose the name that this is being stored as. And let's make the name the topmost parameter that we see. And so now we know which axis this is. And then this is just kind of like a helper group. I don't think it's worth the effort to make a full, I don't know how useful this thing is outside of the context that we're building it. So I don't want to build a full asset. But so what I'll do is I'll add a version number here, just so that if I copy and paste this and I make a change, I know like, oh, I should update that version number, and now I'll know if there are copies that are out of date. So having done this, I'm now going to create my other versions of this. And you know what? I'm realizing that probably the simplest way for me to do this is just to rotate or transform one of these. So I think I'm actually going to get rid of this name input, get rid of it here, and I'm actually going to move this storage outside. So I'm going to copy this out, get rid of this right here, and I'm going to name this one here so that I can take this vector primitive and I can just transform it and name each of the different copies. So let me add a transform geometry. And there, I think there might even be a geo orientation node, which makes this even a little bit simpler. So if I output this, I can choose to kind of change this orientation, right? So I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees, negative 90 here. And so now this is my x-axis. And I'm going to duplicate this, and this is going to become my plus y. Let me just output this. And then I tapped Q, but I ended up just disabling this. So let me adjust my y-axis here. So I'm going to rotate it on. Here we go. So this is now my y plus. And let's just go ahead and name each of these. So this is going to be, this first one here is going to be my x-axis. This next one is going to be my y-axis. And this next one here is going to be my z-axis, which is already named, so I don't actually have to do that. Okay, so now I've got these three different axes. I can output them individually, or I can choose to connect them. I'm going to go x, y, z in order. Output that, and now I've got all of these. And so I can make a group this, call it axes. And then there's one other output style that I was thinking about. So let me just do a save incremental, which is to output a sphere so that you can more easily see a surface shape. So to this, I'm going to add a sphere. And the sphere, I'm going to just take the radius value, use that same thing. I'm going to use that if statement trick, outputting a geometry. So if we want a sphere, and I'm just going to add another name. I'm going to call this, I guess, sphere. Store sphere. And I'm going to add an additional connect here. You know what? I can probably just pull this out and we'll just connect all of them. We don't necessarily need a separate name there. Let me call this sphere. And then there's probably one piece that we're missing. Let me just see. We've got the rotation band that's done. We've got our three axes. Colors aren't done. We've got a sphere. I think there's one more thing I want to add, which is an origin. And for that origin, I want, and you know, actually looking at the sphere, let me just ensure that sphere is turned on. let's take a look at the mode here. I have a feeling you're only going to want the sphere or the lines or the bands. So we might just choose a different output mode accordingly. But let's just use the checkboxes for now, right? Let's keep it fairly simple until we really need that. And let's add that origin. So I'm going to add just a cube. And that cube, the size of it, I'm just going to make it double thickness. So multiply times 2, double thickness. Connect that out. And let's name this origin. And we can probably do that same check mark, although yeah, let's include that as well. And I'm just going to add one more down here, origin, and connect that out here. And I think this is probably silly, but it's probably cleaner to have the if statement at the end here after the name. Something like that. No, I think it's cleaner to see the name at the end just so you kind of know, oh, this is the final output here. So I'm just going to rearrange this. This is going to have like no impact on performance, I don't imagine, but just helps to keep the graph a little bit tidier. So I've got my origin. I've got my sphere. The sphere should not be included in this axes group, I don't think. So I'm just going to drag it out. And the origin is probably the centermost thing. And so now we've got our origin is done. Let's just add one more thing right here. And let me, now that this is here, let's apply some colors to this. So I see that we are storing x-axis. We're storing, that we don't actually have different names here. So let me update the name for y-axis, and let me update the name for z-axis, x, y, z. We now have 3 colors. Let me make sure the name sphere is here. And it should be selecting all polygons. And sphere I want to activate as well as origin, let's say. Okay, now we're getting all of those. Great. And if sphere, you can select all of these and tap the L key if you want to just sort of tidy up the arrangement if you haven't done a lot of sort of pre-tidying. Last but not least, let's apply a material preset for each of these. So I've pre-created some materials for each of these, and I'm going to call, let's just drag them over in order, X, Y, Z, and I believe we named this origin. So I'm going to rename this origin. This is named X underscore axis, Y underscore axis, Z underscore axis. And then for the sphere, I think I'm just going to go with a white color. Call that sphere. So now, if I look at my axis, I have the ability to turn on this sphere or not. I've got the ability to show the origin or not, the line, the tip, the band. And I think that, you know, if this is something you're just putting together for a scene and you don't plan to redistribute it, this is like way more work than you should put into it. But just for teaching purposes, I'm going to show how I might package this up with a slightly cleaner user interface to make sure that, you know, you don't have to click through all of these different things, right? You don't probably want to do this. You probably want to be in either sphere mode, maybe with these tips, but you definitely don't want bands. Or you might want to be in one of these other modes. So I think if sphere is on, everything else is off. And so we're either going to be in sphere mode or axis mode. And we can choose whether or not to make these others accessible. So I'm going to reorder this so that sphere is the top parameter here. And then if sphere is enabled, I am going to kind of hide these other options because I don't think they're particularly germane. Or we can change this to a drop down. Okay, so if something's going to modify the UI, it's generally better to have that as a quick tab. And the easiest way to make a quick tab like this is to add a switch. So the switch allows you to switch between two different values. And I'm going to have two different modes. So the mode is sphere or axis. And I think the default mode should be axes or sphere. And I'm going to add this as an input for mode. And if it's 1, right, so this next value here, let's set this to 1. Let's set this to integer type. This is effectively going to be the same thing as setting this to true. So we can actually get rid of this sphere option. We've got our mode switch. And what we can probably say is that the true false value for line tip band, this is going to be some combination of the value of whether or not we're in axis mode. So if we're in axis mode, then we can turn on the line or the band. I'd say line or band. And I'm going to order the origin at the top here, just because it's sort of the topmost thing. And I will say that the origin is going to be sort of not the value right here. So let's call this mode. And I can say, well, okay, so there's two approaches for this, or a few different approaches. We could just toggle on whether or not we're outputting this different kind of geometry. Are we just outputting the sphere geometry or the axis geometry? It's only complicated based on my desire to also have these tips. So let's go with the slightly more complicated version where we're building the Boolean logic. Okay, so if I am switching my mode, right, so this is axis, this is sphere, or axes and sphere, do I want to have a line available? So if I add a not after this, so this gives me the opposite value. So if they choose axes, which is 0, not that will give me 1. I'm going to call this axis mode. And so now I can say, if, or rather, axis mode is going to be this, and I'm going to use an AND operator here. So that's a Boolean AND operation. So each of these the line value is going to be, so axes and line. And then axes and band. And I'm going to say that the origin, we're going to use that same thing. I'm using command plus shift to drag with my connections here. And so now this is origin, axes and origin, because you don't need the origin if you're in sphere mode, I don't think. And so we've got a little bit of Boolean logic here. We've got this sort of mode switch. And now I just want to visually represent this. So band is not being used. So let me just connect that. And now I want to adjust my user interface. So that my axis is properly available. Okay, so last but not least, let me just do a save incremental here. And now we're just going to go over the sort of the final finesse of the UX here. So I'm going to go into Edit Resource. And my mode, this feels good. I'm just going to change it from a dropdown to a quick tab radio so that it is quickly visible here. So if you see a quick tab, and you should don't overuse them, really just use them if you were going to, this sort of mode toggle is going to change the UI below it and affect the visibility or the enabling of things. The quick tab is kind of a cue for that. They can easily be overused and kind of clutter your UI otherwise. I'm going to rename these to axes or sphere. And origin is going to be here under a thing, line, band. I guess I could add a group right here and call this axis. Or I guess we could say output, these right here. And then I want to choose whether or not they are visible by default. So I'm going to choose to set the default value for all of these as to be enabled. And then I'm going to, in the advanced tab over here, choose whether or not they are enabled. So origin will only make sense if mode is equal to 0. So the enable condition here is curly brackets, mode, close curly brackets, equal 0. Same for line. It only makes sense, and we can test this, right? If I go over here to sphere, we've got this enable disable happening. Same for line. That's the same enable condition. Same for band, the enable disable condition. But the tip is something that I want to maintain in sphere mode just so that I can also have a clear sense of the orientation of the sphere. And do we want the user to be able to fold these or not? I would say, right, because the goal is to provide the simplest possible user interface that we can that really accomplishes the user's needs. But if there's a power user, let them like dive into this. We might rework this over time, but I'd say that this is feeling pretty good. And I just feel like maybe our sliders here, you want to have a usable range. And I feel like if you're trying to dial something in really in a smaller area, this is going to be too much. So for my radius here on my general tab, I want the default step here to actually be 0.1, maybe even lower. My thickness probably, again, 0.1 or 0.01. And let's say that the default radius is actually 50. And the default thickness, let's say, is 2. And my thickness, let's say the maximum thickness is going to be 10, just so I've got, again, a more usable range. And the maximum radius, let's say, is 200. And I'm now going to sort of close this out. I've got my UI UX sort of dialed in. And if this is something that I want to reuse across projects, I might save this as a, as an asset, but then we lose the ability to have these materials here by default. So you could also just drag this over into your assets browser as a new object preset, and it'll come in as this sort of open group. But you're probably, if you're using something like an axis for visualization, there's a good chance that you're going to want to be able to customize things. Maybe one other thing we might want to add is the ability to further round these segments out. But I'm going to leave that as, let's call it an exercise for the viewer. My goal with this axis is something that is very performant and lightweight, so that we don't run into sort of conflicts here if we can, or rather, so we don't run into a situation where we've got just a ton of geometry for something that's just meant to be used for debugging purposes. If I was trying to create an axis for final render, I might use a different approach, kind of like I used with this, arrow example scene in the assets browser. Inside of here, you can see that it's an arrow primitive, and I'm building a spline, which is then being lathed in order to create this shape. So that's an alternate technique you could use. But this is a nice lightweight way of building this. I don't think that we're going to need the Kanban board moving forward. You can always re-add it, but let's just clean up the node group by deleting it. I just wanted to record a quick addendum to talk through where I landed with this after a little bit more tweaking. So I've got the ability to adjust the radius, the thickness. I can switch from an axes mode to a sphere mode. I can also choose whether or not to include a tip in that sphere mode, and the same is true in the axes mode. In the selections tab, which is new, you can change the name of the selection tags that get created, just making it a little bit easier for the user to discover where those selection tags are coming from, the names of them, why they're there. And then I've also added a colors tab, and this colors tab is driving a vertex color or a points color on these objects, and the color values are being set here. And I'm choosing purely saturated red, green, and blue for the axis colors to make it a little bit easier to select for them in a nodal shading graph. And the advantage of doing this is that you could use a single tag on your object or a single material on your object that is reading in those vertex colors or those points colors and using them to drive the appearance right here. So this is a lot of different options here, maybe a little bit overbuilt, but that goes into the process. And just a quick explanation of how the color is being done. I have got a geometry property set, and I can choose to set color. And the geometry property set node has got a few different options. And this is the current, as of 2024.3, the best current workflow for this is to easily set a color to all points. What you would do is you take a geometry property set, and rather than building an array, you can just choose to set a fallback value. And I'm setting that fallback value to a custom value, which allows me to choose a single color that is going to control all of this. If I want, again, I could plug in an array, but I'm just going to use this single fallback value to set my color. And then I'm hiding all of my non-connected ports right here just to sort of clean up the appearance. So that is how you can quickly set the color for all points. And because we're doing this before we get to the connect object, that's an easy way of setting the colors for certain parts of your object. All right. I hope this is helpful, and you feel free to use this axis object in your projects. Hopefully it makes it easier to debug your setups and to better visualize what's going on inside of your scene nodes work.